To introduce our next speaker, IREENA VITTAL. She is an independent director on the boards of some of India's best companies and has a great and deep insight into how consumers are likely to go from where they are today, particularly bringing knowledge on the table on two subjects that she's worked a great deal on, agriculture and urban development, both in India and in emerging markets. She's also co-authored several studies relating to both the subjects, agriculture and urbanization. She's a BSc in electronics from Osmania University and also a PGDM from IIM Kolkata. Please put your hands together for IREENA VITTAL this afternoon. Welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's both an honor and a pleasure to be here today. And my topic, the topic given to me was an interesting one. It was called Coping with Change. And I thought a little bit about what it meant. And I thought the best way of talking about this was to start with some of the questions that I have been asked in the last couple of quarters, couple of years, by entrepreneurs in India. And I'm sure some of these are familiar to you, and perhaps some of them are not. People talk about a new bar. My consumers go on. People talk about volatility. There's nothing today like a monthly volume which is predictable. Every year we have a new change. Every quarter there seems to be something new. How do I run my business when India has become volatile? People talk about margins being under pressure. There is a crazy new game in town. There are many more players. A lot of them are playing with private equity money. So some poor Canadian retired person is funding discounts in India. How do I compete? And people talk about transitions. My son is now educated. He's not so interested in my business. He doesn't think it's sexy enough. What do I do? So maybe some of this resonates with you and maybe some of it doesn't. But to me, coping with change is about what you and I feel when we think about our businesses. And so I thought I'd talk to you about three things. One, what is changing in India? The four forces that are visible. Second, what is the new game that's emerging? 6 or 7 things that one is seeing players do as they adjust to the new reality. And third, what could perhaps you do Monday morning if some of this was relevant for you? So let me start with the first, which is the four forces that are visible in India today. The first one of this is clearly rising demand as the economy grows, as the country grows. The simplest way of understanding India is by this income pyramid. This is how I've thought about India for 20 years, and this is still relevant today. And let me take you back a bit in time to take you forward into the future. If you looked at 2005, which is what this pyramid shows, there were about 204 million households in India. On an average, households in India used to be about 5.4 people per household. That's changing now. Urban India is 4, rural India in part is 6, and in other parts is 5.4. But for an average, it was used to be 5.4. And at that point in time, the Indian household used to break up into a structure which looked like this. The top, which is called globals, were very, very few, 1 million. The real excitement in India was the 10 million that was coming up. And these two, 11 million households, was where most of the consumption was. The bottom, 136 million, are the really poor people. And these people continue to remain poor. They're smaller in number. But this is why the Gates Foundation spends so much of money in India. These people are not coming into any relevant consumption for another 20 to 30 years. They still go to sleep hungry, which is why food inflation in India is always lurking around the corner. But for the most part, this is the structure of the economy. And it's fascinating to see what's happened to this economy since 2005. What's very visible is the top 2 segments, consuming India, has tripled. So whatever we said about NDA's performance or non-performance, whatever we say about BJP's performance today, the fascinating thing about India in the last 10, 12 years is the relevant market, the market which can afford to consume, the market which saves, has tripled because we've had a steady year-on-year GDP increase. And this growth, by the way, is not magic, it is mathematics. The same thing happened in China in 2001. The whole income curve shifted to the right. And so while per capita income is $1,600 in India, these two segments are consuming segments. What's equally fascinating is what will happen in the next 10 years. Based on the old GDP calculation, if India grows at 6.1%, which means on the new GDP calculation, if India grows at about 7.4%, this number will almost double again to 81 million. So the reason India is hot and exciting, despite the cow crisis and despite low GCF and despite very low capacity utilization. The reason India is so exciting to the world is because even at a 7.4% new series GDP growth rate, consuming India will continue to grow. And this is why this market remains the last big market in the world which still has to grow. Now, what's fascinating about these consumers is, in the last couple of years, the experienced economy has been much more subdued than the discussed economy. And so it's not been as wonderful as everybody thought. You know it, you feel it perhaps better than I do. And so even within this segment, you can see that the globals are okay. The big problem has been, what do I do with the cash that a lot of them sit on? What do I do as the taxation regime gets stronger? But their consumption hasn't been hit in any way. And so if you see premiumization in India, in every category is happening to a very large extent. The real challenge is for the consumers. They are big, they have very huge aspirations. Their brands increasingly are being used for them as a source of power, but they are worried. Because when consumers don't spend when they earn. Consumers spend when they earn and they think tomorrow will be better than today. Because if they don't think tomorrow will be better than today, then they save, which might be good for you, by the way. But for most consumers, one of the reasons spending in this middle segment has been subdued is because of the job market, because of the volatility in this market. A lot of people are saying, maybe I'll postpone my next house, maybe I'll postpone my next car, maybe I'll postpone my next motorcycle. So consumption is happening, but it's not happening at the same pace at which it was, say, in 2008, 2012. But the biggest hit of the last couple of years has been on the segment below, the engine of India's growth, the 170 million aspirers. They are the ones who are the most worried. They are the ones who are the most jittery, primarily because of jobs, but also because if you divide this, more than half of this market sits in rural India. And rural India has not seen a huge amount of growth because urban India's inflation is rural India's income. And as inflation has got controlled, rural India has really struggled with its income growth. So while the overall story of India continues to remain unquestioned, the last couple of years have been particularly volatile because it's been fascinating to see that premium markets in India, the premium segments of every market in India has grown, but the base has been growing much less in real terms because most of the consumers coming into consumption are a bit more hesitant than they used to be a few years ago. But what's equally fascinating is who are these consumers? Half of them are in urban India, which means the other half are in rural India. Now, the good news for you is they're not in 630,000 villages. About 11,000 villages account for most of this rural consumption. But when you think about consumers in India, don't assume Bombay, Delhi, Pune and Nasik. They're also in smaller towns and they're also in rural suburbs. The second thing is, from a growth point of view, 49 metropolitan clusters. This chart is not very visible, but because growth is so linked to investment, and investment is so linked to urbanization and infrastructure, a lot of the growth will actually happen in a very, very concentrated manner. So the 50-50 split you see between urban and India is going to move more and more towards urban India, and rural is going to grow, but it is going to grow much slower. And finally, a lot of them are incredibly young. A lot of them are coming into consumption for the first time. A lot of them are thinking about brands and relationships again. You talk to these consumers, a lot of them will talk about old relationships and say, that's my father's relationship, that's my mother's brand. And so it's a huge open space to rebuild brands, if you have an existing brand, to keep it relevant. But if you're a new attacker brand, to build a brand, because a lot of relationships are up and open. It's equally interesting to keep one thing in mind, that the visual imagery of this consumer is not an English-speaking MBA person who works in large companies like Franklin Templeton or Unilever or Airtel. The heart of India's consumer is a businessman. 11% of Indians speak English. Even amongst this consuming market that's going to come, the visual image that you need to have is not a tax-paying corporate person. That market is very small. The heart of India's consumer is somebody who's a distributor for Unilever, somebody who runs a petrol pump for BPCL, somebody who owns a few truck companies, a self-employed professional. He might run a small oil mill, he might run a small tax mill. And the reason I'm putting this all together for you is many times, and you might not do this, but many times people have a stereotype image of Indian consumer, which is IIT, IIM, English speaking, lives in Bombay, works in Unilever. That's not who the Indian consumer is. The heart of Indian consumer is a self-employed professional, gets along very well in English, but perhaps is comfortable in his own vernacular language. Also, very strong community connects in his old community, lives in 50, 60 towns, and has very different sources of trust than the old consumer, which used to be the Calcutta bandbox guys or the Bombay and Delhi corporate guys. But they're also incredibly young, and so they don't have the old affiliations that their parents did. And so what's happening to these consumers? They're going to increase in number, they're young, they have strong aspirations, they're going to consume differently. And so what you see is they're spending in a different way. They're moving away from traditional spend. It doesn't mean that food, which is the largest category, will go down. In terms of absolute spend, even food, which is about 40% of household spend, will increase. But as percentages, it will go down. And what this really means is, in pretty much every category, it is still day one of the growth of this market. This is perhaps true even for you, though I don't understand your sector very well. But in every category, whether it's hotels, hospitals, education, travel, of course food, apparel, shoes, automobiles, in pretty much every single category in India, the real market is ahead of us. We are still in day one of the growth of most of the categories. So point number one, which is driving excitement in India and to a large extent creating challenge in India, is that the consuming households are growing. The short term, there is some amount of concern, but the long-term story of India is totally intact. Second, there is huge growth, day one, in most categories. And finally, this is a young market where new brands, new categories, new relationships will be built. And so when you think of India, yesterday's market or what you have today is interesting and relevant, but it's not necessarily sufficient for tomorrow's growth. Most of the growth is ahead of us. Equally importantly, when you think about the consumer of tomorrow, he might not look like the consumer of yesterday because many more segments are emerging. And as the segments get larger, the game will be about playing in multiple segments simultaneously rather than focusing on any one single consumer. The second force that's visible in this country is the consumer decision journey is changing. Now, this is a big jargon. It basically means how consumers buy is changing. And a lot of it is because a new channel has got created. And this channel is the online channel. I just want to show you two numbers that look at the number of smartphones in India. 220 million in June of last year. And in 1 year, it's 340 million. It's still a very small fraction compared to China. China has 2.5 times as many smartphones. We'll get there in the next 3 years. And then look at the second last column from the bottom. 45 million regular 3G, 4G data users have gone to 120 million in the last 1 year. Now, what's the implication of this? The implication of this is not that smartphones are growing, not that Airtel and Jio are in a battle. The real implication of this is there are many, many people in India today who are getting online. And as they get online, the way they think about buying is changing. If you think about how consumers buy, the old model, which is in blue at the top, used to be you made consumers aware of your product. They were interested, they tried your product, they bought it, they became loyal, they stayed with you. There is a whole new step that has emerged in purchase, and that is search. Even in a market like India, for those of Indians who are in online, perhaps most of your consumers, 85% of Indians today will search online before they decide which store to go to. They might not transact online, but which store to go to, which restaurant to go to, which brand, which model to buy. And I know of a brand in India, which is a beautiful brand, a services brand. They had everything right, and still they were losing consumers. And when they did a whole bunch of research, they realized it's because their online presence was so weak that when consumers searched, they didn't even fall into the consideration set. It was not about pricing. It was not about brand. It was just about relevance. When people talk, earlier you would call up a friend and say, what's the new restaurant in town? You do that, but you also check out Zomato. And so one of the things to realize is that consumers are buying still. A lot of them are still buying in-store because India is a very low-trust society and we don't trust unknown people. But the way consumers are buying everything in India, products, services, marriages, there is a new step called search. And unless you win in that step, you're going to struggle to get enough of the consumer base. And that's the second big trend in India, that there's an extended customer decision journey. Search now comes before awareness, and if you want to be relevant to your community, you have to win when they search for you. And there is a new word-of-mouth source. I mean, remember, we are a very, very low-trust society. The only two societies in the world which trust each other less, or as less as India, are Black South Africans and Chinese. And because of that, word-of-mouth matters a lot in our society. There is a new source of word-of-mouth, which is the online communities. People rate. People look at ranking. People look at what people have said about you. And most people who talk about others talk about them when they are in pain. So you need to make sure that you also have positive endorsement for you. But new sources of influencers and word-of-mouth creators have arrived in this market. And finally, in India, this will continue to remain true for the next couple of decades till we become a high-trust society. So that's the other thing that's changing for most entrepreneurs. The way you access your consumers, who your consumer is changing. It's no longer one kind of consumer, it's many segments. But how you reach this consumer is also changing, because the traditional ways of accessing him are still relevant, but a new online channel with its own dynamics has emerged. The third thing that's changing in India is growing competitive intensity. Now, this country has always been about entrepreneurs. The heart of this country has never been government. The heart of this country has never been multinationals. It's been Indian entrepreneurs. They have always driven the growth of this economy. And what's equally wonderful to see is that the next generation is actually as excited, if not more excited, to be entrepreneurs. For now, there is more than enough capital. In fact, people will tell you there's much more capital than there are ideas. And so a ridiculous number of companies are being supported and being invested behind, 99% of which will die, and as the game is. But fintech, for example, is really hot. Food is currently very hot. And so you're going to see many more players trying out totally new models. Their business models are also different, because one of the interesting things that's changed as capital has changed is, and as sources of access has changed, is business models are changing. And barriers to entry are going down, because you don't need the same kind of scale that you needed when you had a fixed cost-driven business. And so you are entering, and for the next 5, 6, 7 years, till capital becomes rationalized in the world, we are going to see a large number of new entrants coming in, some of who will survive, a very small minuscule, as it happens everywhere. But the rest of them are going to play at the marginal cost of their cost, and a lot of them are going to create a whole amount of pressure for your own margins. They're also going to take talent away. So the implication of competitive intensity is not that the consumer will switch. The real implication of competitive intensity is your pricing will be under pressure, and your cost of talent is going to be high for the next couple of years. When the market settles, we'll see what new business models will emerge. But remember, in the West, which are 5 or 6 years ahead of us, in category after category, after the first wave of death has happened, people have realized that it's incumbents who've been able to reinvent themselves, who have the right to win in the market, because they have the most important thing, that's relationships. And everything else can easily be learnt, and everything else can easily be taught. And the final thing that's changing in India, like it is elsewhere, is there is increasing regulatory pressure. A lot of this is because there is a huge growing trust deficit between society and business, between government and business. Everybody in business assumed that there was a social contract between business and government, between business and society, which was a given. And so you played in a certain playground, the boundaries of which were defined by this trust. But the last 10 years have been very, very bad for this trust. And the trust has actually got lowered. A lot of it was because of things like the big financial crisis of 2008. A lot of it in India is because of NPAs. You talk to the government, and the government says, we know who are the chores. We know, this is what Raghuram Rajan said, that the companies go bankrupt, but the entrepreneurs don't. And when you have this kind of NPA sitting on a banking system which is 60-70% owned by the government, and the politicians, not all of who are totally kosher and clean either, but the politicians know who has made money, it makes them question, and it makes them really wonder every time business goes with a new policy or with a new agenda. They're always saying, what is the angle in this for you? And the NPA thing has not done anything to strengthen the relationship. You talk to politicians, they'll say, businessmen take care of themselves. And it's finally the government who's left, government, not politicians, who's left holding the can. And it's the middle class and the poor Indians who are left holding the can. The Silicon Valley monopoly is not helping either. The new villains in the world are not the bankers of New York. It's the Silicon Valley monopolists, the Googles, the Facebooks, because people are now starting to realize that behind that liberal conversation are shark teeth-based monopolists who are increasingly aimed at owning the world. And so the fact that regulations are demanding more transparency, the fact that more regulators are being created, the fact that everything is being asked for in terms of transparency is an early sign. And this is not going anywhere. It's not going anywhere in the world. It's not going anywhere in India. Expect to see more pressure on transparency because we haven't rebuilt trust between business and society. We haven't rebuilt trust between business and government. And so these are the four big forces, actually, which are at work. The good news is it's all evolutionary. Very little in India is revolutionary, and neither is this phase. But if you look at the combination of these factors, growing consumers of many different sizes and shapes and segments, while we are used to one big consumer segment, now you have to play multiple games. A new channel which requires you to be present online, when we don't always understand what is digital, how do you win, how do you own these influencers. Competitors, most of who will die, but who in the short term will bring down margins and will increase your cost of talent. And finally, a government and society which no longer gives you leeway to do what you want and looks at you with suspicion and demands more and more transparency. And the combination of all of this is obviously an environment which is no longer familiar. And an environment which is no longer familiar is called change. And that's what we're really going through. So what does one do? The implication of all of this is, in some ways, that's the reality outside. For most organizations, the battle is actually internal. And here's why it is. Because what it requires you to do is it requires you to behave like an attacker, not an incumbent. If 90% of the market is ahead of us, there's no point in protecting what you have. You've got to pretend that you are entering this market for the first time and attack. So your valuable customers will get hunted. You need to build a moat around them. There's a whole bunch of new customers that have to be acquired. You have to think about what is the game to acquire. And maybe you have to pretend as if you are in day one when you started the business and not live by the rules that you have built over the last 5, 10, 20 years. The second big change is you've got to renew your value proposition. A lot of the stuff that you offered earlier is perhaps now visible. What is the range of options? I'll give you a better price than the other guy. This is now increasingly found on the net. And so it's level one, which is now commoditized and hygiene. And what you need to do is you need to think about what is the next version of the product or service that I'll offer. And that will also get commoditized in 6 months. And then what's the next version of the product and the offer? So a stable market where you had to think about your customer proposition or your customer relationship once couple of years now requires 6 months, 9 months cycles of version 2, version 3, version 4. And this in jargon is called agility. All it means is your consumer is going to get what you offer very soon from 5 other people. Why should they stay with you? Give them another reason to stay with you. And cost and price is unlikely to be a sustainable feature because the guy who's private equity funded doesn't have a cost structure, doesn't have a margin expectation. So in any case, his cost is much lower than yours. So you need to continuously evolve. That's very different from an India, which was much more stable and where you could take deep breaths and stay with the same proposition for many years. Technology is an enabler, but relationships are still the game in town. Technology can be bought, and technology itself keeps changing. It's fascinating how much people talk about technology, but at the end of the day, trust matters. And which is why incumbents, if they reinvent themselves, are the natural winners in a whole bunch of categories. Because with customers, today, the challenge for customers is they have too much of choice. And when they have too much of choice, they need somebody who will hold their hand and say, I know you can look at 2,500 options, but this is still what is best for you because I understand you. I understand what your risk profile is, I understand what your needs are, and let me help you navigate choices. So consumers don't have an easier life. Consumers have a visible opportunity to negotiate prices down, but they're actually much more confused because more choice creates confusion. And in this process, if you have much more choice, you have much less trust. Anybody who owns a relationship has the right to still be the winner. So technology is an incredible enabler, but it's not the panacea for success. It's still relationships. And finally, margin models need a revisit. Some of us, and I'm not talking of you guys, some of the incumbents have got fat and happy. You assume that you will have a price increase of 1 to 2% year on year. Those days are gone. You need to think about a price cost squeeze of 1 to 2% year on year. You need to think about productivity from technology, but you have to think about a new way of collaborating with an ecosystem, to think about natural owners of pieces of your business and then hand it over to them. Margin models in every single category, whether it's property, whether it's food, whether it's airlines, whether it's telecom, have fundamentally shifted, not just because of technology, but because the way the ecosystem works has fundamentally changed as transaction costs have got lower in the world. So while the world outside us is changing in terms of consumers, channels, regulations, and competition, the real change is inside organizations. Because you've got to now think about your game differently. How do I behave like an attacker? You've got to think about reinventing your proposition more often. You've got to think about using technology to rebuild and strengthen relationships. And finally, you've got to think about a different margin model. So how does one do all of this? When I was invited to do this, I went and spoke to 15 different people who I think have done a good job of reinventing themselves in India. And there seem to be a few common thoughts that I thought I'll quickly share with you. The first one is, it is a new game. And the first big decision a lot of them seem to have made is, where do I place my bets? You're not going to win every segment. By the way, the good news for you is there are many more segments which are large enough. But you've got to place bets. The bets could be geographic. If you're already in a city, then the best is segments. If you're already in segments, then the best is community. For example, a steel player who I think has done a fantastic job decided that they have a particular product in steel, by the way, right? You can't get more commoditized than steel. And they had 16 different users of steel that they found in Middle India and in East India. And within that, they've chosen 7,000 customers. And their basis of choice, other than whether this guy will pay back my money, which is obviously important when you're working with SMEs, was, do these guys belong to a certain community? Because if you go to Bihar, if you go to Patna, or if you go to Calcutta, and you have a bunch of people who are all, say, from Marwadi community or from, the Gujju community, it's so much easier to drive adoption if 50, 60 of them belong to a certain community. This country is still community-led. And so it's incredibly important if you want to be relevant in a segment, to think of the cut that you want to own. The cut could be geography, the cut could be city, it could be segments, it could even be communities. But it's important for you to make a choice, because the good news for you is there are many, many segments. You don't want to do an AK-47 and sell a little bit across segments. You need to own some segments and own them big. So the first thing is making choices. The second thing is redefining category. It's very different to say, I will send you a safe computer versus selling you a patch. It's very difficult to say, I'm going to do delivery for you. So for example, I spoke to a bunch of distributors in Bombay for a FMCG company. And in the last 6, 7 years, they've gone from about 80 crores to 800 crores in turnover, each of them. And what was fascinating was to see how they thought about their business. So they said 8 or 9 years ago, we used to think our point was we had a certain geography in Bombay. We would cover the outlets, A+ outlets every week, A outlets every 2 weeks, B outlets once in a fortnight, C outlets not covered. But that's changed now. What we've moved to is, using technology, we've decided that we are not only about breaking bulk. We now offer 4 services for which you get money. We help our customers think about what range they should carry, because we can help them decide what sells and what doesn't sell. We help them manage inventory, because we can say we can come and do a special drop for you during Diwali. Don't take a position early on, which means the credit we've given in the market has also dropped, because we are doing many more drops. We've changed the way we are thinking about peak management. And finally, we are helping them change merchandise. So they don't think of themselves anymore as distributors. They think of themselves as people who are helping their customers do asset management. And by the way, because of technology, the scale and the play that they have is much bigger. So you've got to think a little bit about, what business are you in? Are you in the business of breaking bulk and delivering goods? Or are you in the business of making 500 customers turn their assets better, because you have their data and you can tell them what to buy when and how to merchandise? You've got to think whether you're selling a patch which helps you protect your data, or you're selling a safe machine which you switch on 365 days, all 20 people in the network, and WannaCry will never hit you. They are 2 different games, depending on whether you sell a product or you service a need. And a lot of players are starting to revisit this and say, what business am I in? Am I distributing a product, or I'm helping a guy have a happier life when he retires? The third thing is a visibly differentiated service platforms. And what this really means is to think about any product feature that you offer, you've got to be a bit like Apple and say, this is version 1. And 6 months from now, I'll have version 2. And 6 months therein, I'll have version 3. And don't introduce a product feature when you cannot see a version 2 and version 3, because you know your competitor is going to copy it within 3 months. And so you need to have enough customer insight, which basically means you need to speak to 20 customers every month and say what's on your mind. But you need to think about what is it that you're offering in much quicker cycles and think of versioning them, because it's only when you're differentiated that you'll be able to make some amount of money. Fourth, paranoid about cost. I have never seen, Indians have always been good about cost, but I've seen version 2 of cost paranoia emerging. And it's not just about, I will run my business with 2 people and I won't have air conditioning in my office. It's about productivity. I will pay a person 10 times more than I've ever paid somebody before. But you know what? He's going to make me so much more productive. People are revisiting business processes. People are revisiting how do they think about digitization and thinking about cost in a fundamentally different way. And then finally, very quick, reach still matters in this country. It's still an unmet market because so many customers are still not reached. And most people are thinking about direct, how do I reach customers directly? How do I create options for customers to help themselves, self-serve? I don't know if you know, but this new generation, their 4th preferred choice is talking to somebody. The first preferred choice of buying something or resolving something, especially resolving something or getting information, is self-serve. The second one is they want a mail. The third is they want an IVR. If this doesn't happen, then they want to talk to a person. So the consumer is changing. He is very, very comfortable with doing self-serve. And you need to think about where, based on the structure of, margin structure of your business, how are you responding to how he wants to engage with you and with your business? And then finally, in India, in China, a local insider with a stable team always wins. Because it's a low-trust society, if you stay in a place for year on year on year, you build a positive word of mouth, you belong in a certain community, you're able to offer them new versions, not necessarily cutting edge, but good enough, you will always win because there is so much of value in this country for trust. So it's not rocket science. I wish I had a silver bullet. I wish I could tell you there's dramatic stuff people are doing. People are not doing dramatic stuff. People are just saying, I've got to have a new business model. And it's a whole bunch of small things. Some people are doing all of this. Some people are doing some fraction of it. And the real question is, what does this mean for you? The thing that struck me was, I think I got the wrong topic. I don't think this is about coping with change. I think this is about managing growth. And the real issue for me is actually a mindset switch. When India is going through churn, when the manthan is happening, first the wish will come out. First the poison will come out. But then the good stuff will come out. That's what is happening. This market is churning. And if you think about managing growth, the first big choice is actually, and this is going to sound very loosey-goosey, but the first big choice is actually an emotional decision, which is, and it's not a logical one, it's about your mindset. Do you look at this market and say, this is a tough market, I have to change? Or do you look at this market and say, this is a big market and it's my market to lose? That switch is incredibly important. Because what you see is where you get to. And if you see chaos around you, you're thinking about coping change and de-risking yourself. But if you see the chaos as part of manthan, and the manthan will give poison first and then good stuff, you will think about, this is a piece that I'll go through, and at the other end of it, dar ke aage jeet hai, at the other end of it will be huge amounts of growth. And so to me, the first big switch is actually an emotional one. The mindset of, this is about growth, this is my market to lose. And the second one, a decision that perhaps all of you will take on how big do you want to be. Because if you are at the start of a market, then you will jump as high as you want it to be. To me, this is the first big decision. You can't take it today, tomorrow. You'll take it when you're emotionally ready. But a lot of people who are reinventing themselves are starting with a recommitment or otherwise. And if you're not committed, it's okay. You've run a successful business and maybe it's time to do something else. But it is an emotional choice. And once this is done, you potentially start with where the business is, which is your portfolio. And I don't know your business. I'm not talking about Templeton, Franklin Templeton, but I'm saying this is where most entrepreneurs start. They start with, what dhanda do I have? And it's really about, it's not about changing it, it's about growing it. And so what you have, your portfolio today, you protect it, you lock in existing relationships, you move them up the curve. The portfolio of 12 months out, which is adjacency, you use your current portfolio to get 40% more or 60% more. And then the third thing, which is 2 years out, you place a few bets. You do all the three things today. It's not that you do the third piece 2 years out. But you know that to get into new categories, to get into new services, there's a learning curve. It'll take you 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. And so you'll bet on it today, but you'll bet it assuming out of 5 bets that you place, 1 will be a huge success, 2 will be colossal failures, and the rest of it you'll just about break even. So you manage your time, and you manage your capital, and you manage your people's time on these 3 different horizons that you play at the same time. How do I ring fence my current core and uptrade them? How do I grow adjacency using word of mouth? And then how do I place a few bets? And once you have a sense of this, then you pick and choose which of the others make sense for you. So to me, coping with change is actually about managing growth. And this is an exciting market. The real question is, how much do you want to do in it? And if you are ready to do something about it, then it's actually not rocket science. It's a series of small steps that you'll do. And 3 years later, when you look back, you'll realize that your business model has evolved. It has morphed bit by bit. And the business you run looks very different from the business you had 5 years ago. But it's not going to be overnight, and it's not going to be a silver bullet. So I wish you well. I hope each of you is as successful as you want to be, and you make a lot of money in this fascinating market of ours. Thank you.